Welcome to episode 229 of the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This episode is with Tony Strudwick. Tony is the Director of Medical at West Bromwich Albion. Tony's also held roles with the English FA as an exercise scientist, at West Ham United, Blackburn Rovers, Head of Performance at Manchester United, and recently Head of Performance with the Football Association of Wales. In this episode, we cover some of the lessons he took from working with Sir Alex. We speak about building a high-performance team. We speak about what makes the best players in the world successful, how coaches stand out as best in class, how he rates the level of support in football, and what we can do better as an industry. I hope you enjoy the episode with Tony. Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is a very special episode today. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast by Director of Medical here at West Brom, Tony Strudwick.
Thanks for having me on, Ben. Big fan of the show, obviously, and it's been a long time coming, right?
It certainly has. No, I really appreciate you freeing this up and also having us here. We're at the training ground here at West Brom, so it's great to come down and do this in person, which I do like doing with these podcasts, so I really appreciate you freeing up some time. We've got quite a bit to get through in terms of topics today, some of which I'm really excited to speak to you about. I was umming and ahhing on topics to start with. I feel like there's one area that I've got to go into first to make sure we box it off. You spent a number of years working with Sir Alex Ferguson.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of players recently doing podcasts and doing interviews talking about the sort of values and standards that he put onto them that they've carried forward. I wanted to ask a similar question to you.
Yeah, it's an easy one, isn't it? And I think that the main thing, I was incredibly fortunate to join Sir Alex for the last 6 years of his career at Manchester United. So I think from that perspective, a lot of the kind of cultural behaviours and values that were pretty much set and consistent. I think one of the key features around the environment, it was just so self-managing. So the players will drive the standards, the setup around how we operate and how you buy into certain things was really, really easy. So in one sense, it was a pretty straightforward role to go into. I think that the flip side of that is that some of the key things you learn for Sir Alex is that he was a serial winner, and so he was always looking to drive innovation. We always used to say that for his from his perspective, it was that treadmill was always moving. So it's when you won one league, it's okay, what can we do to move on to the next one? And I think there's a really famous quote by Sir Alex about what sports science offered him, and some of the major advances in the game have come through sports science. And I think that was quite refreshing, Ben, because we're going into work with a very experienced coach that had been in Manchester United for 20 plus years. But what that shows is that even at that phase of his career, he was still looking for ways to keep ahead of the competition. And that was always the mantra behind Man United. So we talk about high performance. What is high performance? What it's about: being efficient, creating the right product. But in the football environment, in the sporting environment, it's about winning and success and driving standards on. So that was kind of great. It feels a little bit like that defined my career a little bit, but because subsequently, and in fact before that, I mean, if I look at all the kind of experience I've been really, really lucky working in the industry for across 4 decades now, I think it is. But every environment you go into, you take something from it. So from my first role at Coventry, that really was about totally immersing yourself in what it's about. Then I had roles at the English FA, West Ham, Blackburn. They were the kind of apprenticeship years going into to providing that. And so going into work with arguably the most successful manager in the history of, certainly in history of British football, was terrific. I think to come on to it, the other things we learned from Sir Alex and certainly things that I would take away from a leadership style was that it was about relationship-based coaching. And I go on about that all the time about, if you're a young practitioner or a young fitness coach, it's about building a rapport and a relationship with players, and he was fantastic at that. And it's finding ways to connect, not just talking what we talk about transactional sort of transactions throughout the day, but it was really about getting to know people, connecting on a human front, and that was really, really important. I guess the other thing around that was, and he was fantastic, the power of observation. And again, I've kind of taken that into to really the kind of this space of sports science, medical fitness space, in that we have access to innumerous amounts of microtechnology and technology and data, but the power of observation, watching players, their body language, how they communicate with, and he was fantastic at that. And it's kind of that in a blink, that snapshot view of where, getting a good feel for where a player was at in a given moment of time.
You hear about that relationship that he's had with players, and there's obviously a number of famous examples that have come out since, where he's known about players' families and occurrences that are happening in their lives and all that sort of thing, isn't it? Do you think that was like a natural thing for him, or do you think like that was a skill that maybe he developed over the years?
Probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
I think natural. I mean, every coach I've worked with, they've got strengths and weaknesses, and some are, if we have a kind of continuum between over here that are very, very relationship boats, it's about working with players and sort of reaching out to them, and others that are at that other extreme where it's just really is business in the football all the time. I think it would have come natural to him, probably, again, from how he grew up and sort of his life experiences himself, but probably recognised the need and requirement that certainly when you're working in a very fast-paced environment, that's Man United. It's a big club, it's a big machine. So that kind of ensuring that you kind of, and I use that expression, touch players every day.
Yeah.
Ensuring that you connect with some. These are the players that are going to go out and, give 110% on a Saturday afternoon. So it's very important for him to understand, what their wife's names was, what their children's names, and how many children he had, where they lived, and so on and so forth. And it's building up a holistic picture of his athletes.
Yeah.
And for me, that's great coaching.
100%. I wanted to go on to, and that's something that you've had experience with in building a team, a high performance team, and maybe some of the factors that you have to think about when building this team, because it's important, isn't it, to get the right people in the right roles?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, and we'll talk about the growing nature of multidisciplinary teams. I think one of the things, certainly, actually, Sir Alex used to mention it all the time about the staff were getting too big, and it was a bit of half jest, but it was half serious as well. Is that I think when you have a smaller team, you can have more intimate relationships. The connections that you've got within a team are quite tight. And in addition to that, it's really important, and from my experience, when you're building a high performance team, it's about role clarity. In the environments where kind of it's not quite worked, or there's been a sort of like disconnect between the team and the wider club, or the team and the head coaches and management, is when there's a lack of role clarity. Define what everybody does, and I think with that then comes a level of accountability. So if I know what my role is every day, very, very clear, I know what my expectations are every day, and there's a level of accountability.
Yeah.
Where I think, and that was the great thing about working at Manchester United, was that we were quite a lean staff. Number of staff that travelled to away games was circa 12. Now, when you look in the modern day game, you've got another bus for the staff that go with them. So everybody knew their job, and everybody was very clear on their job, and the expectations were, you had to deliver what you needed to deliver, and we were very, very clear with that. Coming back to the building high performance teams, it's understanding the context of which you're working. It's very different. If I was to try and build a high performance unit, for example, at a Sheffield Wednesday or a West Brom, it'd be very, very different to one at Manchester United, because of different context, different resources. So I think that the second part, other than ensuring that there's role definition and role clarity, is finding out and really understanding what is it you need to deliver, and then what resources are then available to pull that together. So, for example, we would love, I would love people to drive insights and analytics here, but it may well be a case of, okay, how can I get the most out of this team that I've got in terms of resources? And I've had them kind of discussions and debates about athlete management systems and data, injury data prediction stuff, and some of these systems will cost £200,000-300,000. Well, if I'm working in an environment where I've got a finite resource to work with, I'm going to put that into human resources. So it's working with that. So I think beyond, when we have the high performance, we've got to really define what it looks like within the context of which you're working, and that's really, really important. And the other thing around that is that you can't just transport one model that worked in one context into another. So probably what works here at West Brom was very different to my experience at Sheffield Wednesday, very different to my experience at Blackburn, and so on and so forth. So that's important. And other than that, I think it's also important to ensure that when you agree to work within this kind of multidisciplinary environment or a high performance team, is that you've got to have a blend of characters. You can't have, I think it's good sometimes to have tension within a high performance working team, because you'll probably have people that are opinionated, that are quite sharp and will drive you onto another level. But you can't have, it's a bit like Sir Alex Ferguson picking his team, is that what works, you'll have to have the kind of support actors, you'll have the main stars, and so on and so forth. So the blend and dynamic of that group is really, really important, and with that comes trust. I think trust is so important when you're working day in, day out in a high performance environment, having a level of trust with each other. And that's probably, if someone was to say what does success look like working in a high performance team, is that if at any given moment of time a player goes to any member of staff, they'll get the same answer.
Yeah.
And that's really, really important for me.
Yeah, 100%. I love that point. I also love the point of it not always being that everyone's going to sit around and agree.
Yeah.
I suppose that comes down to the culture that you develop though at a club, doesn't it? And you're able to feel like you can challenge people, not in a way that you're attacking them, but in a way that you want the programme to improve.
Yeah, because like we said today, invariably when you work in a high performance sport, you're going to have ups and downs. You're going to have injury cries. You will have injuries. You will have times when you've got performance problems. There will be times when players are underperforming. There will be times when you're challenged that, particularly in the modern day world, that a player might want to go external to the club to get a treatment or a treatment plan. And I think that's where you've got to be really, really tight. And that's where it's very important collectively that you can challenge each other, but you create a safety. So before that challenge comes, is that you create a level of safety to say, well, okay, it's okay to speak up and challenge, and tensions are part and parcel of that. And of course, that then prevents a level of complacency dropping in, and I think that can also happen in environments where you don't challenge each other. And for example, it may well be that the performance team, they're winning trophies every year, but not necessarily moving on to the next level. So complacency can set in. You sit behind that and say, well, look, we're doing okay on the field, yeah, but off the field, you may be performing in spite of what you're doing rather than because of what you're doing.
So with that in mind, when you're looking at a team and you're appointing people into positions as well, are there any key attributes that you're looking for with the person? I'm thinking more the person now rather than the actual technical side.
Yeah, I think the key attributes you look for is number one, humility, and I think that comes in with it, is that you're going to get really, really good people across, with a diverse background, and I'll come on to that diversity because that's really, really important as well. I think humility is one, is that ensuring that when we recruit young people, and Sir Alex Ferguson used to always talk about, he'd love recruiting young people with energy, and I think the part of the humility, number two, is energy. They've got to energise the environment every single day, and that's really, really important, because you will be challenged and you will have times when it's difficult. It's not always plain sailing in high performance sport. It just doesn't work like that. So humility is one thing I look at. The second thing is having the energy. I think that the third thing really is ensuring that whoever we recruit, that there's room for growth and there's a development. Whether that comes into the humility piece or not, is there development potential there? And when I brought, blimey, I think I recruited back at Man United over 20 staff, but understanding that they may not be the right person here and now, but if there's potential for growth and development, they're coachable, and that comes in with that coachability piece.
Yeah.
Are they coachable? And we wasn't always looking for the. You're not always looking for the kind of end product at 21, 22, but have they got the potential and the energy and growth to go there? And that's really, really important. I mean, I've often talked about, and I think this is a bigger kind of debate, when you're coming through as a young practitioner, do you go in as a generalist or do you become a specialist really, really early? And I always felt that, certainly from my own foundations and my own kind of pathways, it was great to have that holistic experience. At Coventry City, my first job, worked with some fantastic staff. I was filling up the drinks bottles, I was driving the minibus with the youth team. You're doing the S&C stuff, you're doing the reports, you're doing as then it was heart rate monitoring, and you are doing everything. And I actually felt, and it was 12, 14-hour days, 6-7 days a week. But I think having that experience and that apprenticeship, and that's really what I look back at, a wonderful time at Coventry City with some wonderful, wonderful staff, is that they were the apprenticeship years. And having that, rather than coming in to maybe if I went into Manchester United as my first experience and I'm just downloading heart rate or GPS data and doing a particular task, that's not giving me the kind of toolbox or the bandwidth of me that I need to develop as a practitioner.
Yeah.
So that's really, really important, I think, Ben.
Yeah, and that will cross over as well, won't it? When obviously you're talking Premier League level, Premier League clubs with Premier League resources.
Yeah.
But the likelihood is a younger practitioner is probably going to start in the lower leagues in a role where they're doing all the things that you've mentioned. So if you're not prepared for that.
Yeah, and I say that all the time is kind of 10 years. I think I said this in the presentation we did at West Brom, is that 10 years working in the same role at the same club isn't necessarily 10 years experience, it's 10 years of the same experience. One of the great things working in the Championship now is that you get a really rich diversity of practitioners coming through that are probably working either on their own or they've got a lower number of staff around them. And I think it's a fantastic breeding ground, the Championship, for young practitioners, as is League One, League Two, and so on and so forth. Because essentially, they've got to be creative, they've got to learn on task, and that they can't get quick fix solutions and rely and have so much reliance on technology and they've got to find a way to make it work. And I've got some fantastic staff at West Bromwich Albion. I had some fantastic staff at Sheffield Wednesday. Purely because, like I say, I think it's an immersive experience where you've got to make the most of what you got, and I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, 100%. Just on that, when I speak to a lot of coaches, especially in those lower leagues, and say, like, if you could change one thing about the programme and the way that you're operating in your role, what would it be? What additions would you make? A lot of the time it comes back to adding more staff.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, where's the sweet spot lie, do you think, in terms of staff numbers? Because you referenced about Sir Alex's, albeit maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek quote about the numbers of staff, but there must be a sweet spot in terms of this is too much and this is not enough.
Yeah, I think there's been some research around sort of like small groups of 7 to 9 staff now, albeit we've had an exponential increase in staff support and so on and so forth over the last 10, 20 years, even the last 5 years, it's gone up again. Is that the growing role of analysis, the growing role of individual coaches, of unit coaches, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of gone on to that. There's got to be a sweet spot somewhere, and I think there's got to be, because there's so many different, there can only be so many different connections and so many relationships and voices that you have. And certainly going back into an academy environment in two roles at Arsenal and Manchester United, one thing I found that there was a growing number of voices, staff voices around player development. So we'll use player development as an example. So obviously, the Premier League and ETB have been fantastic for the game, and you've got player care department, you've got a well-being department, you've got your nutritionist, a sports scientist, the medical department, you've got the coaching department, analysis department, and they've grown around that player, and I think that's great to a certain extent. But there comes a point when some of the multidisciplinary team meetings are more about the individual units rather than what the core issue is, which is the player. And that's great as long as we don't lose sight of what it's about, which is about the player. And I think that's the other thing around high performance and building a multidisciplinary team, is that whenever we focus on the end outcome or the performance goal, which is in player improvement or player health and wellness, it's just making sure that becomes a sole focus of what we do. And it's not around, player gets injured, for example, the biomechanist says it's a biomechanical issue, the physiologist will say it's too much load, the physio would point they're still looking at it from their own kind of individual discipline scenario. But to answer your question, you would think that somewhere around, I'm sure the military and the special units in the military cover, they have small teams of 7s to 9s and 11s, and one assumes that is very, very healthy. And beyond that, you start to go into the realms of other social dynamics that can distract away from what the common goal is.
Yeah, I love the military as an example. That's a great point. I wanted to ask around, you've worked with some incredible players.
Yeah.
And this is probably quite a obvious question, but I feel like we can dive into a few different areas from it. But the world's best, some of these incredible players you've worked with, what makes them successful?
What makes the best players successful? Undoubtedly, they've got to have the skill element coming in. I mean, they've got to be talent. So the talent is a given, although I've worked with players that are highly talented that don't get to the levels they need to get to. Resilience is a big thing for me, Ben, and I talk about it all the time, about that robustness, resilience, that survivability. When we look at Ryan Giggs, for example, played to the age of 39, average over 40 games a season, played a game every five and a half days. So that kind of having that ability to train day in, day out and deliver day in, day out, that's probably what differentiates the best from the ones just below that. All things being equal, we say that the mindset, the kind of the physical resilience probably ties in with the mental resilience as well, because you've got you can't have one without the other. If not, you won't have an expression of solid robustness. It just won't happen. So I think they probably come hand in hand, the physical and mental robustness. Beyond that, we always talk about them athletes that are the tip of the arrow, because you work with I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of footballers, and what we're talking about really the best is the tip of the arrow, and they're what probably differentiates them from the rest as well is that it's just a relentless pursuit of performance, wanting to be the best, wanting to win, ensuring that everything in their life is kind of managed to a degree where they facilitate their own performance. So it's self-managing. So you've heard the stories about Ronaldo coming in, the first one in training every day, ensuring that in his mind he comes into training with a plan. It's about self-management during training, away from the training ground. So all them facets of his life, he made sure that they were controlled, with a view that there was that relentless pursuit of performance, and he wanted to improve, wanted to be the best, wanted to win, and so on and so forth. So there are plenty of players that I've worked with are really highly talented lads that didn't quite have that mental and physical robustness, in which case they break down, or they don't quite get to the levels they need to get to. and there are those that really, things like practicing. I mean, I say it to some of the players here, is that if you want to improve performance, there's got to be a level of deliberate practice. And Ronaldo would have been the one, and the players that. And one of the great things we used to have at Manchester United, that the training would finish, and there'd always be a 10-15 minute period where the players would scatter off and work on their own different areas. And it wasn't just kind of in a shooting session where you get a shot every 7 or 8. No, the players would take their own bag of balls and go and work on their own. And that was about, still wanting to improve. And whether that drive, and that's an internal drive to want to be the best and continue to be the best. And that's what probably differentiates them from the ones that are just below that level.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the resilience and robustness of players, because we were talking just before we started recording about schedules and the intensity of games now, the speed of the game. So I'm thinking more about younger players coming through academy systems. How do we ensure that they're ready to go into these schedules? Because obviously things are going to progress as well over the next few years. Yeah,
well, we can go on to talk about the modern developments in the game, and one thing's for sure is that the games continue to evolve. The game is about, now, in my opinion, the game's about high intensity actions, the ability to repeat high intensity actions, and the ability to maintain high intensity actions. And we can see that. I mean, the Premier League's been fantastic the last 5-10 years. We've had unbelievable coaches, some of the best coaches in the world now working in the Premier League. We've had this evolution and movement from Southern Europe really into the Premier League with different ideas, and the game really has been broken down and looking at whether the pressing actions and so on and so forth. So the game's is evolving into that way, and what we'll find is an expression of players that can meet the requirements of the game. Coming back to the original question was about young players, which I think is a really important thing. I've been amazed in some of the academies that I work with, just the large number of injuries that young players sustain, and we can debate that all day. What is it? Okay, there's the decline of physical activity in a school, the PE curriculums, all that stuff that we could spend hours on that. But more than anything else, really, for me, one of the most fundamental goals of an academy is to ensure that these young players are robust and can tolerate training loads. So even if it's at a young level, we scaffold the challenge up. We shouldn't be getting lots and lots of injuries at a young level. We just shouldn't. And there's been plenty of research been around. When young players go into their apprenticeship years or their scholarship years, is that when you're 16, 17, you go into an environment, your first year professional. If a player spends 6 to 8 months out, that's a huge chunk of his development time. And that has a major impact on the success, or their level of success they're going to get to a professional contract. So for me, it's really simple, is that, we want to push the players on, we want to develop the players, but we've got to minimise injuries, and we've got to sort of scaffold this up. And that resilience, building that resilience through really a safe structure, but there will be periods when we expose them, and we always working on that area of risk. That's performance sport, but it's calculated risk, ensuring that they can cope with the level at under 16. Then they go into the youth team, ensuring that they can go into a 5-day working week. Then it's into playing senior men's football, and so on and so forth. And there's got to be really, it's not something you can just throw and leave to chance. And different individuals will have different attributes. Some can cope, some won't be able to cope, but giving every player an opportunity to thrive in that environment is really, really important.
I was just about to say that. So do you feel like there's a certain, because you'd work with players that are super talented, if it was just based on technical talent alone, they'd be playing at the top of the game, but we've already talked about the importance of robustness and resilience.
Yeah.
Are they just not going to get to that point? Is there a group of players that are you think just aren't ready to?
Yeah, I've had some that I can probably put my hand on my heart and say that, and that's probably multifactorial as well. It might be part of the constitutional factors of the kind of psychological and physiological makeup of the individual players. It may well be that they've been exposed in systems where they have broken down, and then they're chasing injuries, because we do know that one of the kind of precursors for future injury is past injury.
Yeah.
So if you sustain a serious hamstring issue as a 16, 17-year-old, that's going to hinder your development and progress. So that's why they do what they do. Why there's a lot of support around players, and we probably saw that after COVID as well. The lockdown, I'm sure that had big implications. We're moving into. I'm sure we'll come on to it later, talking about the kind of the role of the individual coach at kind of senior level. But we're also seeing a little bit of a kind of, not an explosion, but you're seeing a growing presence of, fitness coaches, technical coaches working with under 13s, 14s, 15s, 16s. And I kind of get it, because if you're a parent and the kind of trappings that come with gaining a scholarship, professional contract really, really high, so the parent puts on that. I think with what lockdown did and what COVID did, it pushed individual players towards this kind of this individual coach, because we couldn't work with them, as we were under restrictions in the clubland. So and of course we have the social media explosion that comes with it. So young players are seeing England stars and Man United stars and Chelsea stars on social media, and it's, well, okay, I want a piece of that as well. So it's kind of, it has a cascade effect, but you are seeing that now. And one of the important things around that is that when you have academy players, you know what they're doing, and you know that they're being exposed to the right amount of work at the right amount of time. So that's something. But again, we'll talk later on around what we can do more as an industry to support that.
100%. I wanted to switch it onto the coaches side now. Sports scientists, S&C coaches, and you talked about, when you did the presentation for us at the stadium, you talked about best in class.
Yep.
And becoming best in class. I wanted to ask, when coaches listening, how do they become really impactful? How are they really making an impact in their role and rising to the top and becoming best in class?
Going back to the presentation, we spoke about the kind of projection, this 10-year projection, and with that comes kind of knowledge in the field, and that's really, really important. So number one is having the opportunity in the first place, is being ready for that, putting the grounding work in. I know that in my formative years, I mean, when I was sort of back in 93, 92, 93, I was just getting hours on the grass, working with different age groups and so on and so forth, and you're building the foundations really for planning sessions, delivering sessions, thinking about critical feedback and so on and so forth. So once they've had the best coaches I've worked with, have had the opportunity, and two, have taken the opportunity and really engage in a deeper level of kind of critical thinking about what they do. So getting feedback from their peers, working with mentors, aligning themselves to new ideas, coming back to that humility piece, the coach is being coachable as well, understanding that there's no one way is the right way. So having that, and it's not just about experience per se, because I've worked with some young coaches that are fantastic. They absorb so much of the information around them, and take on so much, even 2-3 years into the role. So that's really important. I think when you get to the level now, is that how do we become top class coaches? You've still got to have that energy every day to want to improve. So, and that was a great thing about Sir Alex. Even at the age of, late 60s and 70s, he was still in the gym. He was still one of the first people in the training ground every day. Still wanting to improve, still reading, and I think that was the other thing, is that not accepting that, okay, this is as good as I'm going to be. Still keep pushing, a bit like your best players, the best coaches are the same.
Yeah.
So getting out there, and I remember, Ben, and that's something that I'd like to see a bit more of. I was really lucky and fortunate to be to come through at the right time in the evolution of sports science in this country and academies, because the FA Charter for Quality that started. There was a lot of courses back then. We were doing 4 or 5 weekend courses. When I worked in Coventry Academy, there were 4 or 5 weekends a year where all the physios came together, all the doctors came together, every single academy, and there was some world-class presentations put on, and it was rigid. It was 4 or 5 a year, and there were lots of conferences that we could go to. There were lots of things that we could, to support our learning and development. It was brilliant, and we had kind of then a generation of practitioners back then that were happy to share, and that's important as well. And it's not guarded. It's like, okay, there's an open door policy, and people will reach out and talk, and that's how we improve as an industry. I'm not so sure that's that. I mean, you're doing a great job, albeit, and it's not fluffing you up, but that kind of development. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you're not careful, when it comes back to that 10 years experience of the same experience, is that unless you get out of the environment you're in and expose yourself to different ideas and how it works at other clubs, is that how do we know we're actually learning and developing? And that's why the kind of CPD stuff, the events that are organised, is that's so important for developing. And it'd be the same for the coaches, is having that diverse experience. And we always used to have coaches at Man United that, Brian Kidd was the famous one that, at the end of every season he'd go over to Juventus or he'd go to a different club and see how the dynamics work. And at that particular time, the Italian fitness industry was really, really strong, and a lot of the ideas were generated by Italian fitness coaches. So finding out what's different and what's out there is really important.
You mentioned about sort of critiquing and analysing your own work. I think that is a really key area for coaches to focus, isn't it? And it's probably something that we probably don't know how to do it that well, do we? If we're working with players, we know how to approach it with players, but for ourselves as coaches, we probably don't. Do you feel like we maybe don't do that as much now because of the sheer numbers involved in sports science, in S&C, coming into jobs? We feel like we maybe have to protect ourselves, not talk about our weaknesses so much, or do you think there's other reasons for that?
No, I think there's a bit of that. I think some of the best people I've worked with and been fortunate enough to work with are really, really honest in that, and they kind of they court feedback, and that's important. Even I always say to my team and my team members, look, feel free to challenge. If you don't agree with what I'm saying, that's fine. That's cool. That's the level of kind of sort of trust that you build up within your team to challenge each other, and you create that safety first before you can challenge each other. That's fine. There's certainly, when we think about the sheer numbers, and it kind of is a problem when we've got 15, 20,000 sports science graduates or whatever is a year and going into, and the market's saturated now, so it's so difficult to get that kind of inroad into the industry. And the flip side of that is that those that are occupying positions are kind of a little bit guarded, or it's about self-preservation, so that can be an issue for sure. But of course, going back to when I first started nearly 30 years ago, is that there weren't many of us around, and so we were quite lucky then in that. I wouldn't say we were the pioneers at the time, but we were quite lucky in that we kind of made all the mistakes back then, and that was quite refreshing. But it is hard, and I do feel for the young practitioners coming in now, is that they're going to have to put the hard yards in. They're going to have to come out of universities, probably, won't be paying mortgages off until they're well into their 30s, and it's going to be tough for them. And what I don't want to see is us losing that young generation of practitioners, because that's really important for us. The next generation, what it's going to look like. And I'd still like to see another kind of, cycle of this evolution process, is that really is that universities now start to deliver bespoke courses that really teach sports scientists and fitness practitioners how to coach and what coaching looks like. not just the kind of numbers side of it and the hardcore physiology side of it. So I think it needs to be linked more into really the context of what skills are required. And that comes back to what we're talking about, is that what skills are required. And I do that with my staff and get them to rate where they're at in terms of not just kind of knowledge-based skills, but soft skills as well. And they're really, really important, particularly from a coaching perspective.
I think the biggest disappointment with this is that there's some unbelievable practitioners doing brilliant work that don't necessarily get the coverage that they probably should, isn't there? And they might like that.
Yeah.
But as an industry, we probably need to be knowing about the work that they're doing, don't we?
Yeah.
And that's where it probably gets covered up.
It does, and it's interesting. You'd always assume that I probably get more. I certainly get a lot less calls now. 20 years into the industry. 10 years out of Man United. Well, no, it's just over 5 years. But from when I started with Sir Alex, really, he left in 2013. So, people always want to kind of know what the big clubs are doing and what Tony Strudwick was doing back then. But I probably think I'm a better practitioner now. 10 years down the line, a much better practitioner. But the phone don't come off as much now. But irrespective, I think the point being is that there's a big world out there, and there's some really, really good ideas. I think what's needed from our industry is bringing people together to share ideas, to share best practice. That works, that doesn't work, to understand why some of the metrics that we use have become synonymous with what we do and what we deliver. Sort of certain KPIs that we have is that, well, okay, if we came together as practitioners over a coffee or whatever it was, like we used to 20 years ago, is then we can start to say, well, actually I do it this way and you do it a different way, and so on and so forth. And that's how we learn not only as individuals but also as an industry.
I know you've covered this a little bit already, but I wanted to ask how you'd rate, looking at different sports maybe, even different industries to a point, how would you rate the level of support that we give to players across the board?
The level of support the players get now, Ben, from probably a young age right the way up to, I think, it's arguably some of the best in the world in this country. And not saying we've got the best practitioners, but the advancement of sports science models, the net impact of the EPPP, the guidelines, is that ensuring that we have a level of support around our players, understanding that the growth of sports science, certainly at an academy level and at first team level, is that there's some really good support mechanisms in place with some excellent members of staff around it as well, from a sports science perspective, strength and conditioning, from a medical physiotherapy perspective. So I do think that probably years ago you might have said, well, football or English football was behind the rest of the world, and we might have gone out to America to look at what they were doing out there, and at that time they might have been seen in your basketballs, your NFL sports and so on and so forth, that they were ahead of us. But I think that's kind of flipped. That's flipped in the last 5-10 years, and there's some wonderful staff, medical staff right the way through, in supporting our players at Premier League and academy level, and even in the Championship we've got some excellent members of staff that are now working and ensuring that our players get a level of service. The challenge behind that, and again I don't want to jump the gun too much at the moment because we're going to talk about it later on in the podcast, is that there's a growing number of players that are now working towards external levels of support, whether that's nutrition, physiotherapy, strength and conditioning. We've also got players now that have got their own analysts and their own technical coaches as well. So that kind of growing area around that, and that's going to be a challenge, not just for the sport. And again, I don't want to steal your thunder because we come back to that, but I can honestly say in my 20-30 years of being in the industry, the level of support now is far superior to what it was 20-30 years ago. and that probably born out of the good work that the English FA have done, the good work that the Premier League have done, generating high levels and standards. Going forward, I would still like to see a mandate of, number one, minimum requirements or minimum standards that you'd expect in levels of support right the way through. Okay, what's the minimum standards and requirements that you would expect at Premier League level for our players? What's the minimum standard you expect at Championship level, and so on and so forth? And they should be the same, really, whether it's a Championship player or a Premier League player.
So with that in mind, the standard that where we're at right now, where do you think, where's the next step? What can we do better?
I think it's really important that as an industry we keep pushing the standards up. I would certainly like to see a minimum requirements document. I know that they do that in rugby. Is not just across the sports science and the medical perspective, but what would be the minimum requirements that are set by the English FA, by the Premier League, to ensure that our players are best looked after? And it really is about a charter for quality, which is where it started 20, 30 years ago. Is that, you know, we've got to have not only the best coaching, but first and foremost is that we've got to ensure that we create the right sports science support and have the right, you know, medicine and health pathways in place that allow our young players to thrive. And beyond anything else is that we have to create a safe environment. So I would think that's certainly one thing, Ben, that we should be, you know, what can we do better? Okay, there should be a minimum standards requirements across that. There should be, in addition to that, then we're now looking at, okay, in terms of qualifications, what is, and it's difficult really because a lot of the other areas, chartered physiotherapists have their own kind of gold standards, as do doctors, and sport and exercise medicine practitioners will have their own. They'll be driven by their own kind of guidelines of what their requirements are. I would still like to see that. We've never kind of cracked that in this area. We'll have, and it's not just about qualifications and a degree, and it's not just about being BASIS accredited or UKSCA, but one would assume that at some stage we should have our own governing body. We should have our own governing body that drives standards of care and practice, as in line with, you know, nutritionists, physiotherapists, and doctors. So that's another thing we can do better. And I think beyond anything else, it's ensuring that one of the things we can certainly do better is still engage in critical thinking, understanding that there are a lot of kind of processes and ways of doing things that are now becoming embedded in practice. I'll give you an example of this. When probably about 10 years ago, there was a paper from Ericsson about the 10,000 hour rule, and that was shared with academy coaches, and it was a famous case actually, because two clubs, one in the Midlands, one in the North East, said, right, we've got to get 10,000 hours. So training hours in the kids went from 10 hours a week to 25 hours a week. What's going to happen? You know, they got an injury crisis within 2-3 months. So I think it's really important. What we can do better is start to challenge. I won't say pseudoscience, because that does the kind of 10,000 hour rule a little bit of a disservice. But it's really important that we have a forum as a group of people, as a group of practitioners, to say, well, okay, this is the common practices that are going on. You know, we're looking at certain things in training load, but it's also about challenging each other and challenging the research. So in addition to having that forum where we can challenge each other, is making sure that sports science is still ingrained in research. I'd love to see more research still going on in clubs. Yeah. One of the key things at Man United, that key to our success, was the number of research. It wasn't just about we're interested in publications. We weren't doing it for them reasons. We're doing it for the right reasons, in that we wanted to improve. We wanted a greater knowledge base in what we were doing. Mm. And it's not about, well, okay, yeah, we've got 10 publications out, Man. It wasn't about that. The whole essence of the performance lab that we had at Man United was making sure that the things that we're looking at are actually quite valid, understanding the insights that we were delivering to our coaches were working from a solid foundation of solid research principles and sports science principles. And that was again coming back to our success at Man United. We had to have a level of quality and assurance that what we were doing was the right thing and gold standard.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And a lot of that you've touched on there, obviously the research comes with time, but it's like short-term changes that we could make straight away or put a bit more focus to straight away. If we were looking a bit more long-term, which I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes with sports science across your career so far, where do you see the next 5 years and beyond?
Well, sports science still lives. I think I was criticised on Twitter a little while back about talking about the kind of iPad generation. Really, is that you're a player, come in and you put an iPad in front of someone. I'm saying about connect with all the things that we've kind of discussed in and around this topic and in the session. It's for me, sports science has still got huge value to the game of football, and I think the sports science I'm talking about is the one we just mentioned about that's inherently ingrained in research principles. The whole essence of sports science and what that was sports science is the study of all the scientific applications around sport to improve performance, to minimise injuries, to support the health and well-being of the player. And that's going to probably be needed more, in my opinion, if we're assuming that the game's going to continue to evolve and coaching practice is going to change. Now more than ever, we need greater training insights. We need more contextual research into how the game's changing. And we're not just talking about global training load measures of distance covered and high intensity speed and sprint distance. We're talking about, okay, what's actually happening within the sessions, the density of the actions, the repetition of the actions, and it's that understanding what's going on in the changing nature of how drills are changing and exercises are changing, us really understanding what it is rather than giving a report back to a coach and going, well, yep, we hit zone 5 and zone 6 markers and so on and so forth. And the flip side of that is that we can't continue to just chase numbers for the sake of chasing numbers. And when I spoke about things being embedded in coaching practice, is that, okay, we must hit 2,000 metres of high speed. Well, who said that? And how do we get there contextually within a football specific context? So that's certainly something we can always, what the next 5-10 years are going to look like. I'd like to see a new generation of sports scientists coming in, practitioners coming into the game, really that have an opportunity really to take the game onto another level. So it's going to, and with that is looking at different courses, looking at different kind of qualifications, looking at different memberships to ensure that we really retain some of the best people within our industry that can kick it on. The other thing around that, and I'm going to touch on the kind of the increasing role of the external practitioner. I did a presentation probably about 6 years ago to Catapult St George's Park, and I said, well, in the next 5 years there's going to be a growth of the individual coach, and I think some rugby dude, we wouldn't let that happen, our coaches wouldn't let that happen and all that, and where we're at now, it's just part and parcel of the game. Yeah. And I'm cool with that, Ben. It's kind of, I understand that there's growth in the industry and growth of the individual fitness coach, the individual physiotherapist, because players, there's a change in nature of the players that are coming through now. There's more of an emphasis on individuality. They want an individual service around them that they might not necessarily feel they get. We should be compelled to deliver that, certainly at the top level, but we've also got to understand in this kind of evolving nature of the generation Z athlete now, whatever it is that they want that personal touch or that individual approach around them, which I'm cool with. The flip side of that, there has to be a level of governance around it. I know some fantastic guys that are working with players, whether it be physios, soft tissue therapists, and that the whole area just needs to be cleared up a little bit, certainly in the future, and in terms of ensuring that our players get a good level of service, that when they go out and they work outside of the club, that we know that there's an emergency action plan for them. We know that they're not going to be training in Dubai at 90 degrees heat where there's not a level of support around them, because that's putting the athlete in harm's way. So that whole area will need regulating, if you want, and whether that comes from individual clubs, whether it comes from the Premier League, the Championship, whatever. So I accept it. We saw it. I saw it at Manchester United over 10 years ago, so we knew it was coming.
Yeah.
And didn't have a problem. As long as there's a close connection and there's constant communication between the external and there. I mean, the old-fashioned traditional coaches wouldn't have had it. Oh, this is the service you get, but I get it. I get why players want to do it. But I think when there's a kind of whole industry around monetising things, and it becomes an industry in its own right, and with that, the individual practitioners outside of the clubs are going to. It's a way to monetise things. So I think again, it just needs a level of regulation.
Because I know there's certain people that want to fight it, isn't there? And sort of hope that it goes away and players just return back to clubs and work with the clubs solely. But how you've said quite openly before, that it's not, is it? It's gonna, if anything, it's probably gonna get more popular.
Yeah.
And we factor that into the approach we take forward as well. You need to decide what the approaches that we're actually going to take.
I mean, working at international levels has helped with that, because you flip side it a little bit. When the international players come away for Wales, for example, they've all got their personal fitness coaches at the respective clubs. They're all doing different things, and we're just managing and facilitating that process.
Yeah.
So it does become a bit like that. But the great thing about working for Wales and at international level is there was constant communication. I ensured that there was always dialogue, pre-camp, post-camp, phone calls. It wasn't just via emails and stuff. It was, okay, how's player X doing? Yeah, and you have that open collaboration with them, and that's going to be, as much as we can resist it or fight it, there's going to have to be an acceptance that this collaborative approach is going to have to happen. And as long as there's a level of kind of, you certainly, it comes back to role clarification and, okay, these are the ground rules. You're contracting the ground. This is the way that we contract, the way that we work. If you're working with my player, there's a level of discussion. Knowing that my player, and that's always a difficult one when you bring specialists into a club like sprint coaches. They'll come in on a Tuesday. They want to deliver that in isolation. They want to deliver the sprint, but they've got no understanding of what happened on the Monday, the Wednesday, the Thursday, the Friday, how many games they've had, where they're at in terms of recoverability and so on and so forth. So there's going to have to be a way of working this through where really it comes back down to it. The athlete's at the centre of the plan, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
But it's there, it's happening, and I think you have to embrace change, and you have to understand the evolution of the modern day player.
Yeah, I love the focus on the transparency and the communication, because I think that's absolutely key, isn't it? And that's probably the difference between practitioners that do it well and do it responsibly and the ones that don't. Yeah. And that's the biggest difference, I feel, isn't it?
Yeah, and it comes back down, Ben, to levels of trust and building that level of trust. And that's really important, that transparency. And that was the same with when you work at international level and clubland. So, yeah, really important, that piece.
Oh, that's been an incredible insight. I really enjoyed that. I think we covered some great stuff there. I put out a few times about people suggesting guests for the podcast, and your name always comes up. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that take an incredible amount away from that. So thank you very much for hosting us, but also coming on the podcast.
No, thanks for having me on, Ben. Like I say, it's been a long time coming, but yeah, really enjoyed that. Good luck.